that you can stream. I think it would be excellent. Apparently, hundreds of people are streaming tonight. Streaming. Um, Briefly, I'm sure there's some folks my age that know Mike Mansfield. I had the privilege, my wife Norma and I, of actually working with Mike Mansfield when he was ambassador to Japan. Norma and I helped set up the sister state relationship at Kumamoto and led, yes, ma'am. Yes, is that better? Thank you. My wife Norma and I in the front row had a help with sister state. I ended up helping with the sister state in China for Governor Roscoe years later. So we've been over there, and I enjoyed working with him immensely. I even got chewed out by him. When I was 31 years old, I was the first commerce director for the state under Governor Schwinden. And I'll tell the story briefly because it's a testament to Ambassador Mansfield's character. Some real estate folks up in Flathead, and it was unnamed, were wanting to start a Mansfield Center on Rocky Point up there. And we were meeting with, some of you remember Chief Justice Turnage, and the governor and I and these developers were meeting. And I asked the naive question, have anybody talked to Mike Mansfield? And so the governor said, how did you do it? So I called him, and I can't remember. There were no cell phones or caller IDs, but somehow I was able to talk to him about 10 o'clock at night. And he said, young man, you tell Governor Schwinden, you tell Chief Justice Turnage, I will have nothing to do with anything named after me or any commercial venture of any sort. And I felt pretty smug because I was the one that asked. So the next morning, I reported back to these folks and glad I called him. But he was matter of health, and I was the messenger for good reason. The Mansfield Center is an amazing place. Sky Borden over here, stand up, Sky, is the deputy director. The director, Dina Mansour, contacted me. When she contacted me, she was on her way to Borneo from somewhere. We're doing some work with the State Department, as the center does. It's an amazing project. I mean, I'll just list a few. Project Bridge Korea, Sports Diplomacy, Academic Exchanges, Lectures and Dialogues on Democracy. They have a major grant from the Department of Defense, Critical Language Program. I hope that's not taken over by Fox News. We'll see. High school interaction, State Department funding, and so forth. So Sky, we're going to have a reception afterwards. We decided to have a reception afterwards so we could talk about Dr. Lauren's presentation. By the way, we met 40 years ago, I think, in terms of when we were up there, when I was up in Helena. So I'm going to start. I want to first of all thank the Chamber of Commerce. We have a hell of a team. We have Rocky Mountain College, Montana State University, and Buchanan Capital, which is my company. We're bringing events to Billings, speakers and other events, and that's the purpose of it. I first wanted to introduce our hostess for the night. Dr. Stephanie Hiskawa is the is the Chancellor of Montana State. She's been here since 2021. She's the first woman to hold the position of Chancellor since the university was founded in 1927. As a first-generation college student, I believe you grew up in Dillon. Dr. Hiskawa holds a doctorate from the University of Texas at Austin, a master's degree from Montana State University, and a bachelor's degree from the University of Montana. Before president of MSUB, she was president of Northwest College in Powell, Wyoming, and served for 7 years as president of the Miles Community College. Please welcome our host for tonight, Montana State University.
Thank you, Gary. Welcome to MSUB. I am so excited to see everyone here this evening. When Gary called and said, "Hey, Stephanie, what do you think?" I said, "Yes." And then I said, "What do you want me to do?" And it is turned into this. And I am so excited and honored to be able to host the first of what I hope is many Mansfield lectures here on the MSU Billings campus. What a great opportunity for our community. And I too appreciate the Chamber's involvement, as well as Buchanan Capital helping sponsor and Rocky Mountain College. You're in for a treat tonight. If you look on your program, I really love the Mansfield legacy, and the Mansfield Center cultivates a dialogue of civility to strengthen our national institutions, founding documents, and leaders. We bring differing voices together to explore critical issues of our world in recognition that more unites us than divides us. And that is the purpose of a university, to bring together groups of people for intellectual dialogue about topics that interest all of us or that are new to those of us who may not know yet. So again, thank you for being here and welcome to our campus. And I'll turn it back over to Gary.
Enthusiasm as anyone we know. Dr. Bob Wilmoth, Rocky Mountain College, president of Rocky Mountain College. When I called him and we started to work on this, as enthusiasm really helped. He began serving his position as the president of Rocky in 2013. Previously, Dr. Wilmoth served as program director for the Master of Physician Assistant Studies at Rocky Mountain College. Bob earned his Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Notre Dame. He worked as a marketing representative for the IBM Corporation while he was an officer in the Army Reserve Medical Corps. He received his Doctor of Medicine degree from the University of Illinois, was a surgical resident at the University of Colorado. In 1991, if any of you remember this, he joined Billings Clinic as a cardiothoracic and vascular surgeon. Dr. Wilmoth retired from Billings Clinic, where he was chief of cardiac services and medical director. He has worked throughout the country with the Saving 5 Million Lives campaign. He has aided hospital trustees on board engagement through executive communication. Please welcome for a word, Bob Wilmoth.
Now you can hear me. Thanks, Gary. I worked for IBM because I didn't get a med school. Just want you to all know that. We're the only ones interviewing at school. And I am actually going to do something different. I'm going to read to you what I said at the last commencement at Rocky Mountain College to 220 students that were graduating. Stephanie is always very up. I don't want to come across being down, but this is how I feel. And I think it's a good segue for you, sir. And everything else. We're a divided society. We really are. I'm reading it verbatim. There's no common pursuit. It seems that every aspect of life, no matter how mundane it is a political topic. This was to the students. There's no distinction for many people between discourse of any kind and their political loyalty. It's a dangerous path, unwilling to find common ground or even agree on common facts. We are plastered with labels that we can't see the real person underneath at times. And rather than focus on what unites us as Americans, we view each other with suspicion, almost creating a tribal mentality. Now, I regret reading this to you because it sounds like this is a downer, especially after Steph, but I believe this. This is the message we gave to our students. So with that, let's get the cure, sir. Deal? Thank you for listening.
To mention that the Billings Chamber took the Mansfield Center nationally, and with a presentation to the National Association of Chambers of Commerce. So after the presentation last year, it was received so well that so our Mansfield Center has been shown because of last year's event to a lot of business people from across the country. Next am going to introduce one of Dr. Paul Lauren's star students. Paul, I assume you had several, but this one's incredible. Dr. Jennifer Eisern is one of Paul Lauren's students. Obviously, when she received a bachelor's degree from the University of Montana, her master's degree in development economics from Princeton University, and her doctorate in both finance and international business from Nova Southeastern University. She serves as chair of the Calvert Impact Capital Fund. It's a pioneer investment fund with 30 years of experience and investing globally. Previously, Jennifer served, and you should ask her how many countries she's been to. All these Mansfield all over the world. It's fun. She served 23 years in multiple roles in the International Finance Corporation and the World Bank Group. Jennifer worked in senior management in New Delhi, East Asia, and Hanoi. Jennifer has authored more than 60 publications on financial sector development and broader economic development issues. Jennifer is a chartered financial analyst and founded 4 or 5 years ago a company called Catalyze Global Impact, and works now on that program. One of Paul's star students, Jennifer.
Thank you, Gary. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight, we're going to be talking about history and politics, amongst other things. So please indulge me while I share just a little bit of my own history with Dr. Paul Lauren. When I was a student at the University of Montana from 1985 to 89, Dr. Lauren was already a leading authority in human rights, diplomacy, and international relations, amongst other things, and already a very special resource on the campus in Missoula. He received his master's and his doctorate from Stanford University in history and political science, and he chose to come to the University of Montana to teach and practice his craft in 1974. That's 50 years ago. And wow, how has Montana benefited from his decision? Dr. Lauren is the first professor who clearly focused my attention on the very real dangers and opportunities in our world. The crucial role of national defense, why international allies are important, our ethical responsibility to ensure human rights, and the stark reality of realpolitik, how the world actually works. His inspiring classes and mentoring helped spark my interest in international affairs. And thanks to that strong foundation, after graduation from the University of Montana, I pursued more education that enabled me to have a career in economic development and international finance. On a personal level, Dr. Lauren exudes a wry humor, and the twinkle in his eyes combines both mischief and warmth. He's intellectually curious, dedicated, incredibly dedicated to his role as a teacher and scholar, and humble as he engages with the world. But what I especially admire is his thoughtfulness. Just to give you one example, in 2017, I had finished giving a speech in the Grizz Stadium at the University of Montana, and we were all walking off the field. And it was a cold and blustery spring day. One of those days when you dream instead of sitting in front of a roaring fire, especially if you've been in an open air stadium for longer than expected. Most of us walking off the field had white knuckles from holding on to our speeches while the defiant wind threatened to blow our notes away from the lectern. We were all happy, maybe even more relieved that our part of the event was over. And as I kept my head down and walked through the crowd, determined to escape the wind, guess what happened? Well, to my surprise and delight, I saw Dr. Lauren swimming against the tide of people and the persistent wind, walking towards me. He smiled and congratulated me with a warm hug, and that meant the world to me. Over the decades, Dr. Lauren has received numerous awards from students, his academic peers, and US and international organizations. Just to name a few: most inspirational teacher, outstanding faculty advisor, Montana Professor of the Year, and UM's very first Regents Professor, established by our State Board of Regents. In addition to his teaching and writing roles, Dr. Lauren was also creating the Mansfield Center in the mid-1980s in close collaboration with Mike and Maureen Mansfield, and launching activities to honor their tremendous legacy of public service. I was a student on campus then, and I remember the inaugural events that he organized. Since that time, Dr. Lauren has shaped the Mansfield Center to become a beacon for democracy and international affairs in the US and globally, both as the founding director of the center and through his continuing service on the board. I am just one of literally thousands of students, scholars, business people, and diplomats who have benefited from just the sheer good luck of knowing and learning from Dr. Lauren. Dr. Lauren personifies the values of Maureen and Mike Mansfield. His integrity, his intelligence, and compassion are lights of hope. And Dr. Lauren is a rare gem for all of Montana and for the world. I am so honored to call him my teacher and grateful to call him my friend. Ladies and gentlemen, we are in for a real treat tonight as Dr. Lauren shares his thoughts with us. Please join me in a warm Billings welcome for Dr. Lauren.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Jennifer, thank you. That's a wonderful introduction. I don't know that I deserve all that. This is a perfect example of ways of being a teacher. It is to see what you're you and see Greg, the other former students here. Privilege to be able to teach you. Privileged to be here this evening. Thank you for coming. I grateful for our sister institution for inviting me. It's very important for me when we set this up that both MSU Billings and Rocky co-sponsor this. Honor the tradition that you represent. And since I'm speaking so much about ethics tonight, I honor the tradition of Rocky for all kinds of reasons. When I agreed to, Gary asked me if I would be willing to come to Billings and give a lecture, and I said, yes, I would. Once we settled that, I said, well, when? To my surprise, and somewhat to my anguish, he said, after the election, not before. And he said, and I think these are his words, look, I know that there are going to be people who will be really happy with their election, looking at a future that they want to see. And I know that there are going to be people who are just happy that the election is over and that they want politics to go away. And I know that there are going to be people who are terrified about the future of democracy in the country. And what do you have to say about that?
The most important thing that I can tell you this evening is that politics doesn't have to be this way, and that it hasn't been this way always. That's the message that I want to give you tonight with the account of Mike Mansfield. In doing so, I want to give you a sense of perspective. I want to talk about the perspective of time. I want to talk about the perspective of space, in the world. I want to give you a sense of perspective of times of crises, a perspective on what can be done in the face of those crises, and also hopefully a perspective on quality and value, which I'll weave throughout the lecture, but certainly conclude on this point of values. All right. In doing so, my guess is that a number of you had the good fortune of knowing Mike and Maureen Mansfield. And if you were in Montana in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, right, or 80s, the odds are very good that you would have a letter from Mike Mansfield somewhere in your personal files. Right? Why? Because he cared about people and he tried to address the problems for all these other things that I'm going to be talking about. He cared about Montanans. And I'd like to give you a sense about that in a number of ways. I want to let him speak for himself tonight, certainly in terms of some of his own words. And of particular importance, I want you to be able to hear the words of people who work closely with him, right? Including some of mine. When I began teaching, I had a piece of chalk in my hand. Now I have a power pointer, and so I hope that everything works. And in the old days, if anything happened to your piece of chalk, nothing could happen. You could still it's a lecture. With technology, you never know. So hang on with me, and we'll see if this works. What's the perspective of space? We wouldn't have to go very far in Billings, Montana to see the Mansfield Center on the side of this building in terms of healthcare. If we went to Helena, Montana, we would see in the state capitol a statue of Mike and Maureen Mansfield. If we were to go north from Butte, a drive on the way to Great Falls, we would see the Mike and Maureen Heritage Highway, right? And for those of us who are fly fishermen, you'd want to stop and take advantage of this. If you came to the University of Montana campus, you would see a number of things. In fact, it would be hard to avoid some reference to Mike and Maureen Mansfield. This statue, not insignificantly called Always Together. You'd see the Mike and Maureen and Mike Mansfield Library, and you'd see the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center. Huh? Now, you'd also see throughout Montana, this happens to be from the Missoulian, but there's a number of similar articles in the Billings Gazette about editorials who just simply talk about in search of better angels. Mike Mansfield was a statesman for all seasons and lived for his country. This is not unique. Right? Now, you could say at this point, well, Paul, this is interesting, but you're talking about an alumni of the University of Montana who did well. And we all are proud of alumni, right? And sometimes they're magnified more than they really need to be. But if I had the power to transport all of us tonight, I would take us to the Capitol in Washington, D.C. When we're in the Senate chambers, I would take you to S207. This is the Mansfield room. It's the Senate caucus room. And what's important about this room is it's elegant chandeliers. There are only two portraits in this entire room. One of them is George Washington. The other is Mike Mansfield, right? A life-size portrait. And if that were not sufficient, I would take you to Tokyo. And anyone who's lived in Tokyo during these years of his ambassadorship would say, as a number of newspapers said in bold print, a giant walks among us, right? So this isn't just a local kind of interest. This is a man and a woman, as you'll see, who made a tremendous difference in the world and went far beyond some extraordinarily humble beginnings. Mike was born in 2003 in New York City. His parents were Irish immigrants who came through Ellis Island. My guess is that the people in this room, like my grandparents, came through Ellis Island to come to America. Right? His mother died at a very, very young age, and his father was in construction and he was injured by an industrial accident. So what to do with three kids? Okay. The father, distraught, didn't know what to do, and he asked his uncle, right, who happened to live in Great Falls, whether he would take the kids. He ran a grocery store. You can imagine this. I mean, here's an elderly couple with no kids, all of a sudden inherit three young kids, including a boy who is absolutely rambunctious. One of the interesting things about this image is that you look at his face, he's not smiling, and he's not a happy boy. This is a rare photograph of him smiling, but I'll let him describe. He can speak for you himself tonight. This is from his own memoirs. After my mother's death, my two sisters and I were sent to Great Falls, Montana, to live with my father's uncle and aunt. I could not get along with my aunt. I was probably a stubborn youngster. I made two attempts to run away from home during my grade school years. I ran away first in 1913. I got about 20 miles out of town before I was caught, brought back to Great Falls, and spent a night in the jail. Next morning, I was returned to my aunt. A year later, I ran away again. I hadn't finished 8th grade when I ran away. What he doesn't say is that he was sent to a reform school in Twin Bridges, right, for a year. I was a hobo. I'd get into an empty freight train and go with it as far as it went, and then get into another freight train and ride that train to wherever it went. I began to work in a logging camp. It was very low, very crude, very simple work. But that's exactly the way it was in those years. He decided to, even though he was too young to join, he entered the Navy in 1918, entered the Army in 1919, and entered the Marine Corps in 1920. 1920 to 1922, he's a Marine. This explains why every official photograph you ever see of him, he has a Marine Corps symbol on his lapel. Well, First World War is over. Marines remained part of his life. This is one of these rare pictures where he's actually smiling. And here's a man, and this happens to other veterans then and today. He leaves the Marines. He's got no job, no money, no education, no family to speak of, no home. Here's a man without a future at all. And so what do you do in 1922, right? You're looking for work. after you've been on the ship, you work in the mines. So he goes to Butte. Well, this is not a picture of Mike Mansfield in the mine, but it could be. He worked in the mines of Butte for 9 years. I mean, 9 years. That's hard, difficult, challenging work. And as a result of these 9 years, he came away, one, with appreciating the value of hard work, but secondly, an expression that he frequently used, that many of us, happy life. It has to do with dynamite in a mine. Happy life, right? Which was, be careful, right? Go slow. Think about the consequences of these things. So he's stuck in the mines, right? With no particular future whatsoever. I mean, if you were putting money on this man, you wouldn't do it because the odds are very good that he's going to not pan out. But something changed his life. It was a woman. Mansfield is speaking to you directly here. After my tour of duty in the Marine Corps ended in 1922, I moved to Butte, a copper mining town. I worked in Butte as a miner and as an assistant mining engineer for 9 years. It was in Butte that I first met my wife, Maureen. Since we first met in 1928, my wife, and I want to read this very carefully, has been the greatest influence of my entire life, bar none. From the time we met, Maureen urged me to better myself and look for work other than working in the copper mines. Maureen told me over and over again, you've got to get an education. And I said to her, I don't even have anything other than the 8th grade. But Maureen did not give up easily. She responded, well, you can make up your high school credits some way and you have to get a better education. Maureen kept after me. You can just imagine these conversations that they'd have. Right? I took some correspondence courses in the summer course at the University of Montana to earn additional credits. After completing my high school equivalency tests in December of 1931, I finally quit the mines and became a regular student at the University of Montana. In the fall of 1932, Maureen joined me in Missoula, and we were finally married. In 1933, listen to this, at the age of 30, I graduated from the University of Montana in history and political science. Those were very difficult days. That's the way that it was. Almost everyone was out of a job in the 1930s. My wife had to cash in her life insurance for us to pay rent. I remember very distinctly buying 3 pounds of hamburger one day for just 25 cents during the Depression. I brought the hamburger back home and thought that I'd really accomplished something and she would be happy. But my wife, Maureen, began to cry. Why? Because we did not own a refrigerator. And the hamburger would begin to spoil within a day or so. So my wife gave the hamburger to some of our neighbors. Prices were very low, but people didn't have any money to buy. I tell you again, it was a terrible era. Like so many people, including us, a university experience transforms your life. That's what it's designed to do, whether you're at U of M or whether you're here at MSU Billings or whether you're Rocky or wherever. It's a question of taking normally young people from 18 to 21 or 22, not 30, right? And helping them transform their life. This experience transformed Mansfield's life and he never forgot it. That is, his wife, because of this constant pushing, encouraged him to go to the university. I've explained that to you. And lo and behold, I mean, the standards were different there, but it happened. he begins to be a professor at the university, and his wife, in order to make ends meet, begins to be a social worker. Now, this is a lecture about Mike Mansfield, but you can't understand Mike Mansfield without understanding his life. You need to take him at his word. And so what I want to point out, this is just a newspaper article. If you start reading about Midway, it says this: she mentioned that she works with physically, mentally, and socially handicapped children, whom she helps to adjust to current conditions. Financial assistance must be given for some children living in their own home. Mothers are taught and helped to care for their own children properly. Unmarried mothers and their children are aided. Assistance is given probation officers and courts. Cooperation with youth organizations is given. This is what Maureen did, and this is who she was. And this is important to the whole account, right? Mike becomes a professor at the university, and I'm happy to say that he taught in the history department. And here clearly is teaching about history and about politics. And it's not surprising that anyone who's doing this is spending time talking about democracy and what it takes to make it work. And what's so interesting to me, if you look at the dates, obviously he's interested in external threats, not internals, precisely. But he's talking about meeting a challenge met by all who believe its fundamental processes and who love its liberties. And this is an important phrase for Mansfield, its responsibilities. I'll come back to this theme again. There probably isn't a professor alive who teaches history or politics who hasn't thought, you know, I could do that good. I mean, why not run for office or something along that line? And Mansfield clearly was one of these, and he decided that he would run for office. But the interesting thing is, it wasn't just his decision. This is the way that he describes it. In Missoula, where we lived, my wife would see freight trains crossing across the state of Montana with lots of people on them, looking elsewhere for jobs. And that made a very lasting and deep impression on her and on me. My wife thought that things had to be done to help these poor. She saw that the state government couldn't do the job. And for that reason, she looked to the federal government for assistance. We decided that I would run for the seat in the U.S. House of Representatives in 1940. The field was open. But of the three Democrats who ran in the Democratic primary, I finished third, dead last. A woman named Jeanette Rankin won the Republican primary, and also Jeanette Rankin was a general election in November of 1940. But like so many people, all of us, I mean, there are times in which you win things and times that you lose. And when you do lose, you have to kind of pick yourself back up and not be deterred from the ultimate objective. And so he ran again. And he is elected to the House of Representatives, begins to serve in the House from 1942 to 1953. Give you some sense of what he looked like at the time. He was the House, 1942 to 53. And then he's elected to the Senate in 53 and served there until 1977. In this task of the Senate, this is where he spent so much of his life, he served as a Senate Majority Leader longer than anyone else in history until just a few months ago. A distinguished career. When we were creating the Mansfield Center, I had occasion to visit with Howard Baker, who was Senate Majority Leader at the time. And I said, you know, let me just ask you, you would have you would have been in the Senate when Lyndon Johnson was majority leader. And you obviously are in the Senate when Mike Mansfield was, but tell me about the difference. And he laughed and he said, I'll tell you what the difference is. It was like going from Genghis Khan to St. Francis of Assisi. And he said, whatever I learned about Senate leadership, I learned about how Mike Mansfield and my father-in-law, this is Howard Baker speaking, who his name happened to be Everett Dirksen, cooperated and worked in a bipartisan way. So what I want to suggest to you is that as he's working, right, he is fundamentally dependent upon Maureen for advice and counsel, right? She doesn't look like she's particularly meek there, right? I mean, she's a confident woman, great assistance to him, and they served for a long time. And so for this group, hopefully some of these slides will bring back a lot of memories for you. I mean, when you're teaching young students, you have to work a little harder to establish. But this gives you some idea of the span of time of Mike Mansfield in the Senate. Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, and Ronald Reagan. I mean, it's almost exhausting as you go through. Here's the point. Democrat and Republican didn't make any difference. The ability to work with them as closely as possible. Now, during this time, and I'm going to be talking about his leadership and his characters. If any of us are fortunate to live in good times, I would argue that it's relatively easy to be a good leader and be successful, right? Because the challenges are not so big. But look at the challenges that I'm going to present to you in this time period. Second World War is going on. I mean, he was elected in 42, so he's still got till the end of the war in 45. Atomic bomb is dropped, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 1945. There's joy at victory. People assume that because people stop shooting at each other, peace is going to be at hand. But it's not true. There's devastation that's going to take years to overcome. I might add, it's going to happen in Ukraine. It's going to happen in Gaza, right? Just because whenever the settlement is made, there's going to be ruins for years to try to repair. Stalin is still ahead. It becomes even more powerful than the Soviet Union. Europe is divided into two by the Iron Curtains, right? East versus West. Mao Zedong comes to power in 1949 in China. Korean War breaks out in 1950, goes to 1953. Then there's colonial empires. Second World War is over, but promises have been made for independence. And so look at this. This is a map that's going to represent at the end of the Second World War. You see French West Africa, nice. British East Africa that goes basically from the Cape to Cairo. You look at British India, you look at French Indochina, right? You look at the Dutch East Indies. These are ready to explode. McCarthyism. People sometimes forget, but in 1953, Joseph McCarthy came to Montana to try to defeat Mansfield. 1953, hydrogen bomb has exploded. Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. I mean, most of you in this audience are going to know these facts and know where you were when these took place. Riots in the It's about civil rights. Assassination of Kennedy. War in Vietnam. Protests against the war in Vietnam. Killings on campuses for those who are protesting. State. Right? Young soldiers drafted for Vietnam who can't vote because they're not even 21 yet. People without any kind of medical care whatsoever. King is assassinated. Robert Kennedy is assassinated. Mansfield speaks out about this, and he says this, I'm quoting from one of his speeches. I grieve for my country. What in the name of God has happened to us? Are we so blind that we cannot see what we're becoming? Are we so deaf that we cannot hear? Are we so dumb that we cannot understand? Are we so filled with hatred that we cannot love and appreciate one another as human beings? Are we so immersed in ourselves that we cannot live with one another in peace? Are we so violent that we fail to comprehend the basic tenets of our responsibility to democracy? Here's a man who's angry and a man who's in pain watching this occur in his country. Riots in the 1968 Democratic Convention, Chicago, Soviet in Czechoslovakia, Yom Kippur War, which is just a foretaste of what's going on now. But at the time, it was absolutely shocking. Pollution in our cities, environment being trashed, Watergate. And here at the time of Watergate, David Broder's statement, people have a right to an electoral system. This is a gentle way to say it, free of shenanigans. Seems quaint at the moment. And capable of yielding honest, responsible, and responsive government. Open not to a party, not to a particular part of the country, but to all, and shaped to meet the needs of all. And this is a man who feels the importance of responsibility to democracy. Resignation of a president. Investigation of an intelligence community that became a rogue elephant out of control. These are times of crisis, right? Not gentle times to develop leadership and say I was successful. So what we know is this. Mansfield began every day working with questions about Montana and his constituents. And for those of you who have letters from him, they would have been written at this time in the mornings. He focused on, he never forgot that he was from Montana. How they wore a license plate board, right, which was well known in Washington, D.C. His conscientious approach to work, the fact that he worked with his partner, Maureen, and he worked with great confidence and cooperation with his counterpart in the Senate, Republican Everett Dirksen from Illinois, in a bipartisan way. These two men respected each other. They respected the Constitution. And they understood it's one thing to win elections, it's quite another to govern. And you can keep that thought in mind for the several months that are going to follow. He also made some real effort to cross barriers. And it's been instructive. I mean, here's Kennedy, a Democrat, Scoop Jackson from Washington, a Republican. And who's the umpire? Mike Mansfield. I mean, I just love this picture. It tells you something about him and the way that he treated his colleagues with respect. And so, what did he do when he was in office? Mansfield, you see him here, and he's done the second in a row with Everett Dirksen. He's the one who delivers the eulogy for JFK in Washington. Some of you may well have been. He's there with a limited nuclear test ban treaty, Wilderness Act of 1964. Then he reaches this point where he appeals to his colleagues in the Senate. And he said, there are times in history, you'd expect a history professor to be able to say this. There are times in history when we need to make a decision. We need to take action, and now is that time. He said, one of the most serious problems this country has been racial discrimination. We need to address civil rights. And so with a great push by Mansfield, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is enacted, probably the most important piece of legislation probably in the 20th century. Let me tell you what's really important about this picture, the photograph. Mansfield is not in it. And you say, wait a minute, I just don't understand this. This would not have happened, right? The reason why he's not in it is because he said, let others take the credit. And can you imagine? He said, listen, we couldn't have passed this if it hadn't been for the Republicans that are willing to support it. And if Everett Dirksen wants to hold his own news conference, let him. Well, you can imagine if you were highly partisan and a Democratic senator, if they get up there, this is a points for us, right? Let's take credit in this for the press. That's just what I won't do it. I mean, it's telling about the character of the man. Similarly, he's not in the picture for the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He's not in the picture when it comes to the creation of Medicare or the Clean Air Act, all of which he played a major role in. And for anybody in this room, and there might be some, maybe those of you in the back, who are not yet 21, but were able to vote because Mansfield felt very strongly about the 26th Amendment, about saying, if you're 18 years old, if you're old enough to fight and go to Vietnam, you're old enough to vote. And he felt very strongly about that. And you can imagine, I mean, as a young veteran himself, he would feel strongly about that. The other thing that he did, and this picture will be immediately recognized by some of you in this audience, this is the Watergate hearings. Right? The president has been accused of violating the law. And what's so important about this is that I want to be as clear as I can about this. There are Democrats and Republicans who say we want to look at the evidence. We want to know what the president did or didn't do. No excuses. And if we find the president guilty, we will charge him. Now, to do this, it's important to understand that Mansfield could pick the Democratic members of his commission. He had two criteria in mind. One, he wanted to select a fellow senator who was not running for president and elect someone, a Democratic senator who was not known as highly partisan, because he said, I want the rule of law to operate here. And it is. Similarly, Mansfield created the Senate Investigation Committee. This is the church committee. And the images that some of you will recognize people. This again is a bipartisan committee to investigate wrongdoing by the Central Intelligence Agency. But any country that does not have a powerful, strong intelligence agency is out of its mind. But in a democratic society, it needs to follow the rules. And so look at this. You're looking at church, obviously, as the chair. But this is John Tower from Texas, right? Howard Baker, Barry Goldwater, Matt Mathias from Maryland. This is a bipartisan committee, and this is just speaks volumes about Mike Mansfield. And so he was told that, by the way, you're going to be on the cover of Time magazine. He said, I don't want to be on the cover of Time magazine. I want to kill it. They said, sorry, it's already gone to press. So that's the kind of person that he was. So in foreign affairs, he taught foreign affairs when he was at U of M. He also was on the House Foreign Relations Committee, the Senate, on the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee. It was his passion. And this begins during the Second World War. Roosevelt sends him actually to Asia. And so what he's doing, whenever he went, he wanted to say, are there any Montana boys here? And he made a real point of not only meeting them, but he had this incredible memory for names. And so he would come back home and he'd write his parents and say, I just talked with your son. You know, we were in India, we were in Burma, we were in China, and he sends his greetings. I look good. He's clearly talking to people on the ground. Truman appoints Mansfield to be on the UN delegation at the time. And if bipartisanship is important in domestic affairs, you can imagine how important it is in foreign affairs, right? You have to respect, you might not agree with them, but you have to listen to your adversary. They may be an ally, right? And you have to understand something about their culture, their language. And he did. He traveled widely, right? Wrote back extensive reports about his trips and had to deal with this question of decolonization. I'll tell a brief story because it has a point. A number of years ago, I was in Algeria at the request of the State Department, giving a series of lectures. It was a dangerous assignment. I was had to be accompanied by armed bodyguards on this assignment. But I'm standing on the shore, on the southern shore of the Mediterranean Sea. This man who was my host, just before I went in the lecture, said, you know, I know something about you, Professor Lauren, but I don't know where you're from. And I said, from Montana. And he said, Montana? He said, let me shake your hand. And I wondered, what in the world? This is North Africa, for heaven's sakes. He said, that's the home of Mike Mansfield. I said, it is. He said, Mike Mansfield was the first member of the U.S. Congress to openly declare that he supported independence from Algeria from French colonialism. No idea. You know, the button just kind of pop off your chest. You say, all right. I didn't know that. But it says something about going far beyond Montana and local things. He also spent time in visiting soldiers in Vietnam. He said Vietnam was his greatest failure in terms of inability to advise Johnson against escalating the war. He obviously spent time with leaders around the world. And this is a picture of Mansfield on the day he retired. He walked out of the chambers, walked down the stairs, and he's thinking, this is over. Right? Now, most of the pictures that you see of Mansfield, he's going to be serious because the issues were important. They're stern. But I wanted to show you he can laugh too. And, you know, he's alone, smiling with important people, smiling with unimportant people. And he has a good sense of humor. And he thinks he's going to retire. His colleagues in the Senate said, we want to honor the man that you were. And we want to declare this room to be the Mansfield rules, Democrats and Republicans alike. And so this picture that shows you the life-size picture is a picture of his face, right? To give you some sense of the esteem with which this man is held. Now, because of that, and I'll be brief on this particular point, there were those of us at the University of Montana who said, look, this is an extraordinary man. This was a giant who walked in our midst, and be ashamed to just let this go. And what we ought to do is create some kind of center in which we can focus on the characteristics of Mike Mansfield. And we can help train students for international leaders with a strong sense of ethical values and how they conduct their lives and how they perform public service. And so the question was how to do that. We spent several years in preparation. Nothing moves fast at the university, right? Committees have to be formed, memos have to be signed. And so we reached a point that we were ready to go, and the university president said, look, well, somebody needs to go talk to Mike Mansfield. If it's got his name on it, we need to know that he's on board about this. So that makes perfect sense. So I got on the plane, coach class from Missoula to Seattle, was getting ready to go from Seattle to Tokyo, meet Mike Mansfield and have a heart-to-heart with him. And I arrived in Seattle. I go up to the counter, and the man behind the counter says, naturally, business or pleasure? I said, business. Oh, he said, well, what do you do for a living? I said, well, I'm a university professor. Oh, well, you probably won't be working with businessmen. He said, government officials? I said, yeah, government officials. I mean, this is going a little further than you would normally do in a conversation. And he said, you're going to the U.S. Embassy? So I said, as a matter of fact, I am. I'm going to the U.S. Embassy. He said, are you going to go see Mike Mansfield? You don't quite know how to answer that. I said, yeah, as a matter of fact, I'm going to go set an appointment to see Mike Mansfield. And he said, give me your ticket. He took my ticket and he went like this. And I wondered, what in the world? Right? He went back to his counter, did something, and he said, here's a first-class ticket to Tokyo. It's a small token of our appreciation for Ambassador Mike Mansfield. I mean, I obviously was the beneficiary. I didn't do anything to earn that. I just to give you some idea of the way that he was held in such regard and such respect. The result was we created the Mansfield Center. Terry has already mentioned something about that. Sky will mention more if you're interested, but there's a whole array of classes, of seminars, of dialogues, such as this, as exchange programs, workshops, training programs. Hundreds and hundreds of students since the 50s have been beneficiaries of the benefits of the Mansfield Center, not just of the U of M, but for the state of Montana, for the nation, in some cases, and certainly countries around the world. Began by doing conferences, not surprisingly, about leadership, character, civic virtue. And I know that there are copies of this report available that Skyboard will provide for you if you want, but it's been 40 years of extraordinary programming for training leaders who are interested in public service and interested in ethical decisions. He became ambassador. It's in this capacity that that prime minister dealt daily with them, was clearly in the news all the time. Here's a man who did not like news coverage, but the Japanese just couldn't help themselves. He worked in commercial areas, where Gary and I first We were on a trade commission with the governor. Worked with cultural issues, exchange programs for students. And in one particular episode that I want to describe to you, had to deal with a very difficult question of Japanese-American relations. That is this. 1981, a U.S. submarine accidentally hit a Japanese freighter, U.S. submarine, and several Japanese were killed. Sub kept on going, did not stop to land the system. And of course, it hit the sands. And Mansfield, the ambassador, demanded a full report. He received it from the admiral. He made an appointment to go to see the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And to do this, I have to use a motion. That is, here's a man who doesn't want cameras around. He said, I want the cameras in this meeting. Mansfield took the piece of paper, he turned to the ambassador and bowed deeply for a long time and apologized for the U.S. Navy hitting this ship and killing Japanese sailors. Now, the response of that, there were many in America, and I followed this case really closely, that really were upset with Mansfield. They said America did not apologize for anything, right? We do what we have to do and with no apology. Mansfield said, we need to apologize. It was a mistake we made. And this particular episode of him bowing was broadcast over and over and over again in Japan. And it helps to explain why he was so incredibly effective and so popular when he was there. Because he understood and had respect for everyone, and certainly for victims. They thought they were going to retire. I invited him back, and I'll go through this quickly, invited him back to Missoula. He came and gave a conference. This is a half an hour before his lecture was to be given. The place had probably 5,000 to 6,000 students in the field house. That still stands up there ramrod straight. I thought I'd made a big mistake by inviting him because of his age. Right? I mean, I can only speak for myself, but I don't have the energy that I used to have. And he just gave this lecture, was proud. Afterward, and you can tell by the people who gathered around, they feel comfortable around him. And I'll come back to this in just a moment. And not at a distance. He's welcoming them, and they feel comfortable for being around him. Visited the Mansfield Library, visited the Mansfield Center, and then maybe my favorite picture. He was just a sweetheart. I mean, they just everyone's grandma. Right? Mansfield Gay was invited at the age of 95 to return to the U.S. Senate by Senate Majority Leader Trent Lott, Republican, and he asked Mansfield to give a lecture on leadership. Leadership in the U.S. Senate. He did. In the profound statement of his belief in democracy and the responsibility necessary to carry it through. Maureen died in 2000. Mike died in 2001. When he died at the specific request of George Bush, W. Bush, all flags in all the federal offices in America, the flags on all of the military bases, and the flags on all U.S. embassies around the world were lowered at half mast because of the respect that people had for Mike Mansfield. His funeral was an amazing, moving event. Fort Myers, Arlington, Washington, D.C. His invitation only, and what struck me so powerfully was the number of his former colleagues, including former presidential candidates on both the Democrat and Republican side, who came to be a part of his service. Many of these I did not expect to see Jesse Helms there. And for those of you who know his politics, you'd be surprised too. walked in with a cane, with someone assisting him with an oxygen mask. He wanted to be there to honor Mike Mansfield, which spoke just volumes to me. All of the services participated in his funeral. Flag was given to his daughter and granddaughter Caroline. Then the question arose about who was this man? And so I want to conclude on this point. After having dinner with Mike and Maureen Mansfield in the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo, Mike went out to do something, and I had a chance just to visit with Maureen. And I said, I'm just want to ask you, when you look back over this career, what do you think his greatest contribution was? And she said, without hesitation, high ethical values in public service. That's it. If I just stopped right here and you looked at these accomplishments, it would be hard pressed to say this was an impressive man. But when you look at the character, you say this was a great man. Right? This is what Maureen saw in him years ago. So what about this man? I want to end on these points. He was humble. This is his tombstone. Some of you maybe have been there to visit. If you wanted to list all of the things on his resume that I've talked about, I've only talked about some of them, it could be a monument, right? Of all of these things that he had achieved. He said, I don't want that. What did he want? This was his choice. Michael Joseph Mansfield, private, U.S. Marine Corps, right? He's a man who wanted to be last rather than first. A man who listened to other people. A man who was genuinely humble, who knew who he was, didn't try to pretend to be anybody different. Moreover, he was loyal. He was loyal to Marine. He was loyal to the state of Montana. He was loyal to the University of Montana. More importantly, it seems to me, he was loyal to this country and to its values, and never wavered, all from them. He also was compassionate. He cared about university students who didn't have enough funding to continue their education. Compassionate to people who needed Medicare assistance. He was compassionate to those who couldn't vote. Compassionate to those who had been marginalized. African Americans, women, many others. Compassionate to veterans, men and women alike, and himself. He cared, genuinely cared about the people. He also was a man with a very deep sense of responsibility. So I want to come back to this. He felt a responsibility to public service, not public position, but public service. He felt a deep sense of responsibility to the rule of law, to the U.S. Constitution, and felt very strongly, and I want to this point on what happens in the future, he felt very strongly in somebody taking an oath of office to defend and protect the U.S. Constitution. He felt that he'd been given responsibility and much was expected of him, and that he believed it was important to deliver on that. Finally, he was an honest man, had a strong sense of right and wrong, a strong sense of telling the truth, right? And this is why people who met him trusted him, whether it was a university student in a sweatshirt, whether it was an admiral, whether it was a king, a prime minister, a president, right? It didn't make any difference. And you had the feeling when you shook his hand that his word was his bond. Right? This is, again, a question of character. Now, you could listen to me or others talk about this, but I want to conclude with these statements. He was called the conscience of the Senate. It's not my words, that's his colleagues. Called him the conscience of the Senate. David Broder, the famous columnist on the Washington Post, said, and I quote him, he's the most famous American I've ever met. Right? There's a guy who worked in Washington, D.C. all of his career, right? The best, most famous American I ever met. His colleague, when he retired, he said a number of things about him. And you'd expect all kinds of things, it seems to me, from people in the same party. But I want to end from a quotation from James Buckley. For those of you who know James Buckley and his politics, you'll say, well, geez, Paul, that's a pretty strange quote. At an end of a lecture on Mike Mansfield. But I want you to hear what he had to say. So he's speaking, these are not my words, but his. Mike Mansfield is a man of few words. And so my remarks about him will be brief, especially inasmuch as from time to time he has found it necessary to chastise this body of the US Senate for producing too much talk and too little work. It's a formality for members of the Senate to refer to one another as, quote, the distinguished and honorable senator, end quote. Even when we were in no mood at all to pay one such compliments as that. But when that phrase is applied to our colleague from Montana, it is much more than a routine salutation to this language. In a period of national suspicion about politics and politicians, Senator Mansfield has stood out above suspicion. An example to skeptics that public service and government can indeed be a noble calling. In a time of cynicism about all of our national institutions of power, Senator Mansfield's long career in the Congress restores our faith in the excellence both of our political systems and in our leaders when they are at their best. Like many members of this Senate, I am not of the majority leader's party, nor do I share his political philosophy at all. But I trust that every member of this body shares the principles to which he has devoted his work among us. Honor, decency, fairness, tolerance. These have been his hallmarks. And those qualities, much more than whatever words we say in praise of him, will remain his most elegant tributes. That's the life and the legacy of Mike Mansfield. Thank you. Hi. And okay, well, that's what I wanted to say. I'm happy to answer any questions that I can in the time that remain, and there's going to be a reception afterwards. So if you have any questions, I'll do my best to try to answer. Please.
The book you're reading from, Mike's words, is that his diary or is it a book that?
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's called a little book of recollections. And he didn't want to do it. And it's just like him, right? But a Japanese journalist who happened to be his friend said, look, you're willing to just have some conversations with me. And so he recorded the conversations and assembled them. And so the book that I'm reading from, half of it's in English and half of it's in Japanese. But I wanted to give you a flavor of him by letting him speak in his own words. You know, he's very candid. You know, upset man. I ran away from home. I ended up in jail. Life was hard. And that it's important to remember that. I mean, we're all products of this time. Whether it's families and circumstances, and Mansfield and Maureen certainly were no exception to that. But I mean, when you add those early years with 9 years in the mine, no education, no job, right? This man is not going to amount to anything. Right? I've indicated before that one of the privileges of teaching is what your students go on to achieve. But if you were a grade school teacher, Tim, in the 8th grade, I can just imagine some report in somebody's office. It's going nowhere. Right? I mean, next question, please. Right. I mean, there was no promise there that anyone could have seen except this woman, Maureen Mansfield. And he said over and over again, I just want to come back to that. He said, if it weren't for Maureen, I wouldn't be here. Right? He said, I'd have nothing to talk about. Right? She made me what I am. And that's why I wanted to spend some time talking about her background and her interest in doing it. She was a remarkable woman. Maureen, her background was in English. Being educational background. No, she went back east to a private school. Unusual at the time for a woman, right? Yeah, she's from Montana. She was born in Butte. Her dad was, worked there, lived there, raised his family there. She went back east, got a degree in English, interested in poetry, British poetry primarily. Came back to Butte and became a school teacher. Right? So you can imagine a teacher wanting to say, hey, go get some education and make something of yourself. Right? And when she was, and amazingly, here she's got this job that I described to you in this newspaper article in Missoula. But she also earned a master's degree at U of M. Yeah. I mean, and it's one of these remarkable women who can do it all. Yeah, at the time, too. So she was, and he wasn't kidding. That's why I wanted to read this statement. She had to sell her life insurance policy for him to stay in school. I mean, that's a pretty moving statement, it is to me. And that's why I wanted to really begin by saying, look, if you were just in Montana, you'd think, okay, well, a local boy makes good, state with less than 1 million people, right? Not as big a deal as you think. It's a big deal. Anything else? Please, way in the back.
Did he have any political enemies or people that just didn't like him?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. It's not your fault, it's mine. I just can't hear the question.
Did he have any political enemies?
Oh, enemy.
Political enemies. Like
Oh, absolutely. Right. I've indicated some hint about that, about McCarthy coming to Mon specifically to defeat him. Every time he ran for office, he had opponents, not enemies, I would say. Certainly in terms of the state of Montana, when the parties talk to each other. I think actually, and this may sound strange to you, but I think some of his greatest opponents, I guess I'd avoid the word enemy. His greatest opponents came within the Democratic Party. This was at the time of Dixiecrats. And look, I'm talking about the civil rights legislation in the 1960s. And when Mansfield said we could have never passed this without Republican support, his biggest chunk of opponents were Democratic senators from the South. who had run on campaigns of segregation. There also, there was an interesting case about Chris Dodd from Connecticut, a Democratic senator, who was really upset about Mansfield for not ruling the Senate more firmly on behalf of the Democrats. He said, look, you're Senate Majority Leader for crime and sakes. Go in there and smash some heads. Wasn't like Mansfield. That's a good question, but that even that's why I wanted to end with a statement by Buckley. Even his political opponents still had extraordinary respect for the man because of his character. They trusted him. Anything else? Yeah.
Would you care to speculate on how you feel about politics?
I had to ask that question. I mean, it isn't funny. It's just, I knew I would be. Yeah, I'll tell you. And I'm glad that you asked, what would he say? Because this lecture is about Mike Mansfield, not about me. This is a lectern, not a pulpit. So my opinion is not important in this. I believe I know exactly what he would say. I think he'd gone far, far beyond angry. Here he talked about being angry. He could be angry. I believe Mike Mansfield today would be in the depths of sorrow. I'm just sad that the institutions have been so seriously challenged, that that money has played such a significant role in American elections. Mike Mansfield actually worked, and this is kind of interesting question. Mansfield worked for public finances of public elections in order that everyone be allotted the same amount of money given the position. He said, if we don't have this, the end result is going to be that rich people are going to be able to buy their way into this office. The Senate will be full of a bunch of rich white men. Oh, those are Mansfield, not mine. So he cared deeply about democracy in terms of one person, one vote. Wealth should not make a difference, right? He also argued strongly that the Electoral College ought to be eliminated, but he couldn't talk his colleagues into it. He said it's anti-democratic. It means that certain states are swing states. Nobody cares what anybody in Montana says in the scheme of things, right? I mean, and that's a dangerous incident to say. So I'm going to answer this question in two ways. That's the first one. What would Mike if he were here tonight, I believe that's exactly what he would say. The first half of his answer. The second half of his answer would be, we've had tough times before. Roll up your sleeve and govern. Meet these challenges. I mean, these are his words, not mine. Meet these challenges and show people what a democratic society is supposed to be about. These liberties and freedoms aren't just freely given. You have to work for it. And they have to be renewed with each election cycle. I believe that's what he would say if he were here. Anything else? Take one more. Hi.
In keeping with the spirit of the week of the upcoming Cat Grizz game, if memory serves me correctly, didn't a very scrawny 30-year-old Mike Mansfield play defensive end for the Grizz football
How in the
team?
world would you know that? That's one of those minuscule little facts.
Only the filler.
He was college, even though he was 30, he was very slender, short. You never got the impression when you met him that you're looking at an athlete, right? I mean, it wasn't that kind of image, but he did play. There's actually a photograph of him in a Grizz uniform. I was hoping that you'd avoid talking about the Grizz Cat game.
Cat Grizz.
For those of you who are not interested in football, this happens this weekend. And the only answer that I can give you about that, and I think that this is worthy of Mike Mansfield. My daughters obviously grew up in Missoula. And one of my daughters went to MSU. And so it happened to be Grizz Cat game in Missoula. And my daughter's sitting next to me, and someone came up and they said, "Well, Jeannie, are you rooting for the Grizz or the Cats?" And she looked at him and she said, "I can't lose."